There is a place in the high country of what we now call Iran, where the wind moves slowly across the plateau and the light falls in long amber sheets across the stone. It is quiet there. It has always been quiet. And yet, from this very ground, parched, proud, and seemingly forgotten by the civilizations that surrounded it, there rose an empire so vast, so deliberate in its ambition, that the ancient world had no proper word for what it had become. They called themselves the Parsa. We know them as the Persians. For centuries they existed on the margins of history, a people living in the shadow of the Medes, their powerful northern neighbors, paying tribute, bowing their heads, enduring. But something was already growing in the silence of that plateau. A particular kind of pride, a particular kind of patience. And in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, that patience became a force that would shatter the ancient order of the Near East and never truly stop moving. What followed was not simply conquest. It was a reimagining of what an empire could be and what a king could dare to become. It began with a man. They nearly always do. His name was Cyrus II, though history would bestow on him a far grander title, Cyrus the Great. He was, by every account that survives him, a ruler of extraordinary and almost unsettling composure. He did not merely defeat his enemies, he absorbed them. He spoke to the peoples he conquered not as a warlord, but as a liberator, offering them their gods, their customs, their dignity, a governance philosophy so unusual for its age that the Hebrew scriptures would name him a Messiah, a shepherd, a man touched by divine favor. And he was Persian. Cyrus did not inherit an empire. He assembled one, piece by deliberate piece. First the Medes fell, overthrown not in a catastrophic battle but in what reads almost like a quiet coup, their own army defecting to the man they had been sent to destroy. Then Lydia, the fabulously wealthy kingdom of King Croesus in western Anatolia, whose golden rivers had made him a legend. Then Babylon, ancient, holy, seemingly impregnable Babylon, taken in a single autumn night in 539 BCE without the city walls ever being breached. The Persians simply walked in through the riverbed beneath the great gates, while the Babylonians celebrated a feast inside. This was the pattern. Speed, intelligence, the unnerving ability to be already inside the walls while the enemy was still deciding whether to be afraid. By the time Cyrus died, on campaign somewhere in the eastern reaches of his domain, the Persian Empire already stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the edge of Central Asia. It was the largest empire the world had yet produced, and it was only getting started. The men who followed Cyrus did not simply guard what he had built, they expanded it, with fire, with stone, and with an army unlike anything the ancient world had ever faced in open battle. Darius I, administrator, architect, and colossus of Persian history, took that inheritance and gave it bones. He built roads that crossed deserts and mountains. He introduced a standardized currency, a postal system, a network of satrapies, regional governorships, that held together an empire of some 50 million souls across 3 continents. He built Persepolis, the ceremonial capital whose ruins still stand today in the Iranian islands, its stone columns rising from the earth like the memory of something magnificent. Under Darius, Persia was not simply powerful, it was organized. And organized power is the most dangerous kind. Then came Xerxes, son of Darius, who would launch the most famous invasion in the ancient world, crossing the Hellespont on a bridge of boats, marching through the mountains of Greece with an army so large that ancient sources, prone to understandable exaggeration, numbered it in the millions. The truth, as best as historians can reconstruct it, was daunting enough. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers drawn from dozens of subject peoples, Medes, Babylonians, Lydians, Egyptians, Indians, Ethiopians, a force of breathtaking diversity, marshaled beneath the Persian banner. This was the empire at its full, terrifying height. A civilization that had risen from obscurity in less than 200 years, that had conquered every rival it had ever faced, that had built a machine of governance and war that no single people had yet managed to stop. What they had built was not merely large. It was alive. It breathed. It adapted. And to understand how it was possible, how a quiet people from a forgotten plateau came to hold dominion over the ancient world, we have to go back to the beginning, back to the stone and the wind, back to the Parsa before anyone knew their name. The world before Cyrus, the land, the bloodline, and the long patience of a people waiting to become. Long before Persia was an empire, it was a landscape. And the landscape shaped everything that came after. The Iranian plateau is not, at first glance, a place that invites greatness. It is immense, stretching roughly 2,000 kilometers from the Zagros Mountains in the west to the edges of Central Asia in the east. And much of it is inhospitable in the way that only ancient places can be. Salt deserts shimmer in the interior, high mountain passes close in winter. The summers are fierce and dry, and yet people have lived here for an extraordinarily long time, drawn not by comfort, but by something more stubborn, the plateau's bones, its defensible highlands, its mineral wealth, its position exactly at the crossroads of the ancient world, equidistant from the great river civilizations of Mesopotamia to the west, the subcontinent to the east, and the steppes of Central Asia to the north. Geography, as it so often does in history, had already written the first chapter. The people who settled this land would have no choice but to become traders, warriors, and eventually rulers. The plateau demanded it of them. The ancestors of the Persians did not originate on the plateau. They arrived on it, part of a vast and slow-moving migration of Indo-Iranian peoples that scholars believe began somewhere in the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, the great Eurasian steppe, several millennia before the Common Era. These were pastoral peoples, expert horsemen, speakers of languages that belonged to the same deep family as Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, a linguistic kinship that would only be understood thousands of years later when European scholars noticed that the Persian word for father, pitta, was almost identical to the Latin pata and the Sanskrit pitta, the same root, the same ancient mouth, speaking across millennia, over generations, moving gradually, the way rivers move, finding the easiest paths through mountain passes and along river valleys. These peoples filtered south and east. Some went toward the Indian subcontinent and became the Vedic civilization. Others turned toward what is now Iran. They called the land Aryana, the land of the Aryans, a self-designation meaning something like the noble ones or the free ones. From this word, with all its subsequent twists through history, comes the modern name, Iran. By around 1000 BCE, several distinct Iranian-speaking tribes had settled across the plateau. Among them were two that would define the next 5 centuries of Near Eastern history. In the northwest, in the rugged highlands south of the Caspian Sea, lived the Medes, and further south, in the fertile region of Parsa, the land the Greeks would later call Persis, in the southwest of the plateau, lived the Persians. At this early stage, neither people was particularly remarkable to the outside world. They were tribal, largely pastoral, organized around clan loyalties rather than centralized political structures. The Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, campaigning westward into the plateau in the 9th century BCE, mentioned them almost in passing in his royal inscriptions, a brief note about receiving tribute from the distant Persians. They were, to the great empires of the age, a footnote. They would not remain one. Somewhere in the early centuries of the first millennium BCE. The exact dates are debated. The sources are sparse. and the line between history and legend grows usefully thin. There emerged among the Persian tribes a ruling lineage that would give the first great Persian Empire its name. The Greeks called this dynasty the Achaemenids. The Persians themselves called it the House of Haxamanic, a name that ancient Greek tongues softened into Achaemenes. Who was Achaemenes? He is, in truth, more symbol than man. The later Persian kings, particularly Darius the Great, would trace their legitimacy back to this founding ancestor with the careful reverence of people who understand that a bloodline is also a political argument. Darius, in the magnificent rock inscription at Behistun, carved high into a cliff face in western Iran, written in 3 languages so that all literate peoples of the empire might read it, declared himself the 8th of his line descending from Achaemenes. But historians treat this genealogy with a respectful skepticism. Royal dynasties have always had a tendency to manufacture ancestors of suitable grandeur. What seems clear is that by the 7th century BCE, a recognizable Persian kingdom existed in the region of Anshan and Parsa, governed by a succession of chieftain kings who belonged to this Achaemenid clan. Their names come to us imperfectly through the filters of later Persian inscriptions and Greek accounts: Tispes, Cyrus I, Cambyses I. These are the generations before the great man, the quiet kings, the ones who held the lineage together through difficult centuries, who paid their tribute when they had to, who negotiated when they could, and who kept the Persian identity intact even as the world around them was reorganized again and again by larger, more violent powers. To understand what Cyrus the Great became, you must first understand what his ancestors endured. Greatness is rarely born. It is accumulated, quietly, over generations. The world into which the early Achaemenid kings were born was dominated, with an almost suffocating totality, by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians are one of history's great colossi, a Mesopotamian civilization that had developed over centuries of warfare and administration into the most militarily sophisticated state the ancient Near East had yet produced. Their armies were disciplined, their siege techniques were innovative, their cruelty in victory was legendary, and, to a significant degree, deliberate. Assyrian kings commissioned detailed stone reliefs depicting their campaigns, cities in flames, prisoners impaled, the defeated led away in chains. This was not simply vanity, it was policy. Terror, spread deliberately through the visual record, was a tool of imperial management. The Persians of Anshan and Parsa existed on the edges of this Assyrian world. They were distant enough from the Assyrian heartland in northern Mesopotamia to escape direct conquest. The plateau's geography provided a measure of natural protection, but not distant enough to be entirely ignored. They paid tribute, they acknowledged Assyrian supremacy, and they watched, with the careful attention of people who know they cannot yet afford to act, as the Assyrian machine ground through the Near East. But even the mightiest empires contain the seeds of their own ending. Assyria, for all its terrifying efficiency, had overextended. It had created enemies in every direction, a fatal accumulation of resentments across Babylonians, Egyptians, Medes, Scythians, and a dozen smaller peoples who had been conquered, taxed, humiliated, or simply threatened for too long. In 612 BCE, the great Assyrian capital of Nineveh fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The city that had seemed eternal was burned. The empire that had held the ancient world in its fist simply dissolved. With remarkable speed, the entire Assyrian state collapsed, and the Near East was suddenly, dizzyingly, open. Into this vacuum stepped 2 dominant powers, the Babylonians, who reasserted their ancient prestige in Mesopotamia, and the Medes, who swept across the northern arc of the plateau and into Anatolia. The Persians, for the moment, remained subordinate, this time to Median rather than Assyrian authority. The tribute continued. The bowing of heads continued. But the world had changed fundamentally. The invincible power of the age had fallen, and somewhere in the courts of Anshan, among a lineage of kings who had spent generations watching and waiting, the lesson was surely noted. The Medes deserve more attention than history has generally given them, and part of the reason they receive so little is the most ironic possible. They were superseded so thoroughly and so quickly by the Persians that the record of their own civilization was largely buried beneath the one that replaced it. They were, by all accounts, a sophisticated and formidable people. Their capital, Ecbatana, built on a high plain beneath the Alwand mountain range in what is now the Iranian city of Hamadan, was described by the Greek historian Herodotus as a city of concentric walls, each painted a different color, the innermost ring sheathed in silver and gold. This account has the quality of legend, and modern archaeology has not fully confirmed it, but the picture it conveys of a wealthy, architecturally ambitious civilization aligns with what we know of Median power at its height. The Median king Cyaxares had been the architect of Nineveh's destruction, the man who had coordinated the coalition that ended Assyria. His successor, Astyages, inherited an empire that stretched from eastern Anatolia to the edges of the Persian homeland. The Persians of Anshan fell within this domain. They were not, under the Medes, slaves or subjects in any degraded sense. The relationship was more feudal than colonial, with Persian kings acknowledged as rulers of their own region, so long as they deferred to Median supremacy and contributed to Median campaigns. But it was a subordination nonetheless, a ceiling on Persian ambition, a reminder embedded in every political arrangement of who was greater and who was less. Into this world, around 600 BCE, though the precise year remains uncertain, a child was born to Cambyses I, king of Anshan, and his wife Mandane. Mandane was, by almost all the sources available to us, a Median princess, the daughter of Astyages himself, the great Median king, which means that the child born of this union carried in his veins the blood of both peoples. He was Persian by his father, Median by his mother. He was, from his first breath, a walking contradiction of the existing political order. His name was Cyrus. The Greeks, Herodotus above all, that tireless collector of stories, preserved a legend about the birth of Cyrus that has the quality of all great founding myths. It is too perfectly shaped to be taken as literal truth, and too resonant to be simply dismissed. Astyages, the Median king and grandfather of the unborn Cyrus, was troubled by dreams. In the first dream, his daughter Mandane urinated so prodigiously that the flood covered all of Asia. In the second, a vine grew from her womb and spread until it had covered the entire world. The dream interpreters, the Magi, those priestly experts in the hidden meanings of the night, told him the same thing each time. A child born of Mandane would one day rule in his place, would rule, in fact, over everything. Astyages, understandably alarmed, tried to manage destiny the way powerful men always do, by force. He married Mandane, not to a Median noble, who might have the resources to support a rebellion, but to a Persian king of modest standing, Cambyses of Anshan. Calculating that any child born to this lesser line would lack the power base to threaten him. When the child was nevertheless born, Astyages went further. He ordered his trusted general Harpagus to take the infant into the wilderness and leave him to die. Harpagus, unwilling to commit the act directly, but unwilling to defy his king entirely, passed the child to a herdsman named Mithridates and his wife, instructing them to abandon the infant on the mountainside. Instead, and here the legend breathes with that particular warmth of stories that know what they mean, the herdsman and his wife kept the child, raised him as their own. The story is almost certainly mythologized, but what it encodes is something real. It encodes the anxiety of the established power, the sense that something uncontrollable was already on its way. What is historically clear is that Cyrus was raised in the Persian tradition, that he grew up understanding both the world of the Medes and the world of the Persians, formed by the tension between these two identities. The subject, people, and the ruling people, the patient and the powerful. By around 559 BCE, Cyrus II had inherited the Persian kingship of Anshan from his father Cambyses. He was, by the formal ledger of the ancient world, still a vassal of the Median king. He owed tribute. He owed military service. He owed, in theory, the entire structure of his political existence to the goodwill of his grandfather, Astyages. He would repay that debt in a way that no one, perhaps not even Cyrus himself, had yet fully imagined. The plateau was quiet. The wind moved across the stone in its old, unhurried way, and somewhere in the court of Anshan, a young king sat with everything his ancestors had taught him, and began, at last, to move. The world would not be quiet for much longer. There is a particular kind of patience that is not passive at all. It has the stillness of a drawn bow, taut, purposeful, waiting not for permission but for the precise and unrepeatable moment. Cyrus II of Persia had lived inside that tension his entire life. By 559 BCE, when the kingship of Anshan passed to him, he had spent years watching the shape of power across the plateau. He understood the Medes. He understood their court, their loyalties, their fault lines, intimately, as only a man connected to them by blood and constrained by them through politics could. And he understood, with the clinical clarity that distinguished him from almost every ruler of his age, that an empire is ultimately held together not by walls or armies, but by the consent, or at least the tolerance, of the people inside it. The moment, when it came, wore the face of a rebellion. But Cyrus was already thinking several moves beyond that. Around 553 BCE, Cyrus raised the standard of revolt against his Median overlord, Astyages. On its face, this was an act of breathtaking audacity. The Median Empire was not a declining power. It had stood for over a century, had destroyed Assyria, had made kings bow from Anatolia to the eastern plateau. Cyrus, at this point, controlled only the Persian heartland, a kingdom real enough, but modest by comparison. By every reasonable calculation, this was a rebellion that should have been crushed. It was not crushed. Astyages assembled his army and marched south to meet the Persian uprising. And then something happened that the ancient sources struggle to fully explain. The Median army defected. Not at the edges, not a few disgruntled units slipping away in the night. The army turned on its own king, Harpagus, that same general who, decades earlier, had been ordered to abandon the infant Cyrus and had demurred, led the defection directly to the Persian side. Astyages was captured, not killed, and brought before the grandson he had once tried to have destroyed. Cyrus let him live. He gave him a comfortable retirement in the Persian court. This was not weakness. This was a statement, the first of many, about the kind of ruler Cyrus intended to be. He was not simply replacing Median dominion with Persian dominion. He was absorbing Median identity into something larger. Their nobility retained their positions. Their customs continued. Their soldiers served in Persian armies. The Greeks, watching from the outside, would for generations refer to the Persian Wars as the Median Wars, because to their eyes, the two peoples had become effectively interchangeable. This was not confusion. It was the evidence of Cyrus's success. He did not defeat the Medes so much as inherit them, fold them into a new identity so carefully that the seam was almost invisible. News of what had happened in the East reached the great capitals of the ancient world with the quality of news that reconfigures everything. And in the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia, on the western coast of Anatolia, a king named Croesus noted it with very particular alarm. Croesus of Lydia was, in his era, the gold standard, quite literally, of royal wealth. The Lydians are credited by many ancient sources with the invention of coinage, and the river Pactolus, which ran through their capital Sardis, was said to carry gold dust in its current. To resolve his uncertainty about the new Persian power, Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi, asking what would happen if he marched against Persia. The oracle's answer has become one of the most famous utterances in all of ancient history. If he crossed the river Halys, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus heard what he wished to hear. He crossed the Halys. The great empire that was destroyed was his own. At the plain of Thymbra outside Sardis, Cyrus deployed a tactical innovation that became the signature of Persian military thinking. He placed war camels at the front of his battle line. Horses, unfamiliar with the smell and sight of camels, panicked and refused to advance. The Lydian cavalry, the finest in the ancient world, was neutralized before a single lance was leveled. Sardis fell 14 days later, and Croesus, captured on the walls of his own citadel, was not executed. He was treated with respect, eventually becoming, in some traditions, an advisor in the Persian court, a living emblem of the reversibility of fortune. There remained, to the south and west, one power whose antiquity and prestige dwarfed every other kingdom Cyrus had yet encountered. Babylon was not merely a city, it was an idea, one of the oldest ideas in the world. Its walls were said to be wide enough for a chariot to turn around on their tops. Its gardens were spoken of as a wonder of the world. The Babylonian Empire controlled Mesopotamia, the Levant, and significant parts of Arabia. Cyrus had been making quiet preparations for Babylon for years. He had cultivated contacts within the city. He had listened carefully to the grievances that circulated in Babylonian society. And there were genuine grievances to find. King Nabonidus had spent years away from the city at the desert oasis of Timar, had neglected the sacred New Year festival, and had alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk. His absence had created a wound in the political body of Babylon that Cyrus understood how to open further. In October of 5039 BCE, the Persian army appeared at the walls of Babylon. Cyrus did not siege. His engineers diverted the flow of the Euphrates River through its channels. On the night of a great Babylonian feast, Persian soldiers entered the city through the riverbed, beneath the great bronze water gates, while the citizens above celebrated and the walls stood unbreached. Babylon had not fallen. It had been walked into. The city that had stood at the center of the world for 2,000 years changed hands in a single night, without a wall being breached, without a temple being burned. This was not conquest. It was something quiet, and in its own way, more complete. The following morning, Cyrus entered Babylon as a liberator. He restored the worship of Marduk. He invited the priests back to their temples. He returned cult statues that Nabonidus had moved, and he announced that the peoples held captive in Babylon, among them the Jews, brought there in the Babylonian captivity, were free to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. It is from this last act that the Hebrew scriptures name Cyrus, a Persian king, a Zoroastrian, a man who had never set foot in Jerusalem, as a Messiah, as the shepherd of God's people. This is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing. A foreign conqueror, achieving the status of sacred deliverer in the religious canon of a people he conquered. In the ruins of Babylon, discovered in 1879 by the Assyriologist Hormuzd Rassam, lies one of the most remarkable objects ever recovered from the ancient world. It is a small barrel of baked clay, roughly the size of a man's fist, inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform from end to end. It is known as the Cyrus cylinder, and it is now held in the British Museum in London. The text speaks of Cyrus's policy of religious tolerance. It records his restoration of displaced peoples to their homelands, his return of confiscated cult objects, his prohibition against coercion in his newly acquired territories. It articulates, in the stilted formal language of ancient Mesopotamian chancellery, something that looks, to modern eyes, startlingly like a declaration of universal rights. Scholars debate the extent to which it truly deserves that title. Some argue the cylinder was simply sophisticated political messaging. Others maintain that the policy it describes, governance through tolerance rather than terror, was genuinely without precedent at the scale Cyrus practiced it. Both things can be true at once. Cyrus was not an idealist in any modern sense. He was a supremely practical ruler who had grasped something most conquerors never did: that a population which does not resent you is cheaper to administer than one that does. His mercy was calculated, but calculation, when it reaches toward the humane, produces results that pure principle sometimes cannot. After Babylon, Cyrus turned east. He pushed into what are now Afghanistan and the Central Asian republics, absorbing territories across a series of campaigns about which the sources are frustratingly sparse. He also met, for the first time, resistance he could not dissolve through charisma or absorption. The nomadic peoples of the eastern steppe, who did not have cities to be walked into or priests whose goodwill could be cultivated. It was among these peoples, somewhere in the vast territories northeast of the settled lands, that Cyrus the Great finally reached the end of his remarkable life. Around 5030 BCE, he died on campaign. The most dramatic account comes from Herodotus, who reports he was defeated and killed in battle against the Massagetae, ruled by a warrior queen named Tomyris, who had warned Cyrus she would give him his fill of blood. He was buried at Pasargadae, in the heart of the Persian homeland. A tomb was constructed of white limestone. It is still there. Alexander the Great, 2 centuries later, traveled to Pasargadae specifically to see it. He found the tomb had been broken into by grave robbers. He ordered it restored. He stood at the threshold and read the inscription above the entrance: "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. Do not begrudge me this little earth that covers my body." The great conqueror of the ancient world stood at the tomb of a greater one and wept. The sources are clear on this point. That is the measure of Cyrus. Not the territories taken, not the armies scattered, not even the cylinder or the scriptures or the gratitude of liberated peoples recorded across 3 continents. The measure of Cyrus is that 200 years after his death, the man who destroyed his empire came to his tomb and could not hold back his tears. An empire that the moment of its greatest expansion is also at its most fragile. The territories are too new, the loyalties too untested, the administrative threads too thin and too recently spun to bear much weight. Cyrus had understood this. It was why he governed as he did, through dignity rather than terror. But an empire held together by the gravitational pull of a single extraordinary man is an empire that depends, dangerously, on that man remaining alive. When Cyrus died on the eastern steppe, the thread pulled tight. His son Cambyses II added Egypt to the empire in a brilliant campaign of 525 BCE, making Persia the first power in history to hold continuous territory across 3 continents. But Cambyses ruled with an anxiety that curdled into something darker, and he died on the road back from Egypt in 522 BCE. The empire, already in the early stages of fracturing, into this instability stepped a man who was not the obvious heir to anything. His name was Darius, a member of the Achaemenid family by a collateral branch, a young commander whose claim required immediate and vigorous justification. He provided it in the way Persian kings always did. He won. In a single extraordinary year, 522 to 521 BCE, Darius fought 19 battles and defeated 9 kings who had risen in rebellion across the empire. Simultaneously, on multiple fronts, across territories stretching from Egypt to the Eastern Plateau. At the end of it, Darius stood alone atop an empire that was battered, tested, and entirely his. Cyrus had built the house. Cambyses had extended its walls into Africa. Darius looked at what remained and saw, with the eye of an architect rather than a soldier, that what it needed most urgently was a foundation. Before Darius built anything else, he built his story. High on a cliff face above the ancient royal road in western Iran, at Behistan, where the rock rises sheer and smooth above the plain, he commissioned the most ambitious piece of royal self-narration the ancient world had yet attempted. The inscription covers roughly 15 by 25 meters of living rock, carved at a height that made it effectively unalterable by any future hand. It depicts Darius in relief, his foot on the prostrate figure of the false Smerdis. 9 rebel kings led before him in chains, written in 3 languages simultaneously: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, so that the literate peoples of every corner of the empire might read the same account in their own tongue. The inscription is propaganda. It is also the key that unlocked the entire system of ancient cuneiform writing. When the British officer Henry Rawlinson painstakingly copied and deciphered it in the 1830s and 1840s, dangling from ropes on the cliff face to reach the higher registers, he cracked open the written languages of Mesopotamia and gave scholars access to thousands of years of previously unreadable text. An act of Persian royal vanity committed 25 centuries earlier turned out to be the Rosetta Stone of the ancient Near East. Having told his story in stone, Darius set about making the empire governable. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, roughly 20 of them, each governed by an official called a satrap. The satraps were powerful figures. They collected taxes, administered justice, raised troops, and maintained order across territories sometimes larger than modern European nations. The genius of the system was not the satraps themselves, but the checks Darius built around them. Each satrapy also contained an independent military commander who reported directly to the king. A royal secretary maintained parallel correspondence with Susa, and the king's inspectors, known in the ancient sources as the eyes and ears of the king, traveled the empire on irregular schedules, appearing without announcement to audit accounts and assess loyalty. No satrap could ever be entirely certain when the king's gaze might suddenly fall upon him. It was a surveillance system of remarkable sophistication, keeping an empire of 50 million people across 3 continents functionally coherent for 2 centuries. The royal road ran approximately 2,700 kilometers from the imperial capital of Susa to Sardis on the Aegean coast. Along its length, Darius established relay stations, spaced roughly a day's ride apart, each stocked with fresh horses and riders. A message did not make the journey on a single tired horse. It was handed at each station to a fresh rider on a fresh mount, passed hand to hand across the full length of the empire like a baton in a relay race. Herodotus, writing in astonishment about this system, produced a sentence adopted 2.5 millennia later as the motto of the United States Postal Service, that the royal couriers were stopped by neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness from completing their appointed course at full speed. A message that would take a private traveler 90 days to carry on foot arrived at the royal court in 7. The empire had compressed its own geography. Roads of power made physical. They do not merely carry armies, they carry law, commerce, information, and the invisible daily thread of a common identity. Darius understood that an empire without roads is merely a collection of territories. Darius began construction of Persepolis around 5018 BCE on a natural terrace of rock in the highland plain of Mardasht, in the heart of the Persian homeland. The location was deliberate. This was Parsa itself, the ancestral ground, the soil from which the whole story had grown. To build the ceremonial capital of a world empire here, was to make a statement about where all of this had come from and what it meant. The construction spanned more than half a century, continuing under Xerxes and Artaxerxes I. What emerged was a complex of palaces, audience halls, treasuries, and gateways arranged on a vast artificial platform of dressed stone, approached by a grand double staircase wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast. The Apadana, the great audience hall of Darius, was supported by 36 columns, each 20 meters tall, topped with carved bull capitals of extraordinary refinement. The processional reliefs along the staircases are among the most remarkable things Persepolis bequeathed to history. They depict, in meticulous procession, the delegations of subject peoples bringing tribute, Medes in rounded caps, Lydians carrying vessels and leading horses, Ethiopians with elephant tusks, Indians with pots of gold dust, Bactrians with camels, Greeks with bolts of cloth. 23 peoples of the empire, each rendered with careful attention to their distinct clothing and customs. But look more carefully at those reliefs. At the spacing of the figures, the gentleness of the hands, the way Persian nobles are shown, greeting the foreign delegations, touching their arms, leaning close in conversation, and something less expected emerges. These are not images of submission. They are images of welcome. By the final decade of the 5th century BCE, the empire Darius had systematized stretched from the Aegean coast to the Indus Valley, from Central Asia to the cataracts of the Upper Nile. It was the greatest empire the world had yet produced. And it was, for the first time, running into something it could not absorb. In 490 BCE, Darius sent an army across the Aegean to punish Athens and Eretria for their support of the Ionian Greek revolt. At the plain of Marathon, on the coast of Attica, the Athenians charged at a run, an unusual tactical choice designed to minimize exposure to Persian archery. And in the collision that followed, the Persian center broke. It was the first time a Persian army had been defeated in open battle by a Western opponent. Darius was already planning the return campaign when he died in 486 BCE, leaving the task and the unfinished reckoning with Greece to his son, to Xerxes, to the storm that was coming. Some campaigns are military operations, others are statements. The invasion of Greece that Xerxes launched in 480 BCE was both, but it was, above all else, a statement. The Athenians and Eretrians had aided the Ionian Greeks in their revolt against Persian rule. Darius had sent an army to correct this impertinence, and that army had come home from Marathon having failed. The world had noticed. For a decade, the memory of Marathon had sat in Persian court consciousness like a stone in a shoe, not crippling, but impossible to ignore. Xerxes understood that the response could not be proportional. It had to be final. He spent 4 years preparing it. What he assembled was, by any measure of the ancient world, staggering. An invasion force of somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, supported by a fleet of perhaps 1,200 warships drawn from the Phoenician and Ionian coastal cities of the empire. To move this force from Asia into Europe, his engineers constructed 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, each one lashed together from hundreds of warships moored side by side, their decks planked over, nearly 1.5 miles long. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes ordered the strait itself to be whipped 300 times and fetters thrown into the water as punishment for its insolence. Then he had his engineers build better bridges. There is a particular quality to the hubris of the very powerful, a point at which the gap between what a king can command and what the world will obey becomes invisible even to the king himself. For 7 days and 7 nights, the army of Xerxes crossed from Asia into Europe without pause. Xerxes watched from a throne placed on a high vantage point above the strait, and then, the stories say, wept. When asked why, he answered that he was moved by sorrow at the brevity of human life. Of all the vast multitude before him, not one would be alive in 100 years. The Greek city-states that stood in Xerxes' path were not, in any ordinary strategic sense, well positioned to resist. Many chose not to resist at all. Thessaly submitted. Argos stood aside. The League of States that agreed to fight was an alliance held together less by common purpose than by the shared understanding that there was nowhere left to run. What they had, however, was geography, and they used it with a precision that has rarely been bettered in the history of defensive warfare. The pass of Thermopylae, the hot gates for the sulphurous springs nearby, was, in 480 BCE, a narrow coastal defile between the mountains of central Greece and the Malian Gulf. At its tightest point, the track measured no more than 15 meters wide. The Greeks placed approximately 7,000 soldiers across the mouth of the pass, including 300 Spartans under their king, Leonidas. In a space that wide, the Persian army's vast numerical superiority was meaningless. The Persians could only advance along the track, and every advance brought them face to face with the Greek phalanx, a wall of overlapping shields and 8-foot spears. For 2 days, wave after wave of Persian infantry broke against that wall and retreated. The Immortals, the elite 10,000-strong core of the Persian army, were sent in and came back bloodied and diminished. The pass held until a local Greek man named Ephialtes revealed to the Persians the existence of a mountain path that wound around the defenders' position. By dawn of the 3rd day, a Persian force was descending behind the Greek lines. Leonidas sent most of the allied contingents south to fight another day, and remained at the pass with his 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians who refused to leave, and a small number of Thebans. The last stand lasted 1 morning. Pushed from both sides, the remaining Greeks withdrew to a small hill and fought until they were killed by Persian archery. Thermopylae was a Persian victory. The pass was taken, the defenders killed, the road south opened, and yet it entered history not as a Persian triumph, but as a Greek legend, because what Leonidas had bought with his death was worth more than the pass was worth to Xerxes. What he had bought was time. Time for the Athenians to complete the evacuation of their city, putting their faith, as the statesman Themistocles had argued, in wooden walls. In ships, Athens burned. Xerxes entered the city in September of 480 BCE to find it largely empty. The population evacuated to the island of Salamis and set fire to the temples on the Acropolis. The smoke rising from the Parthenon's predecessor was visible across the Saronic Gulf to the island where the Athenian refugees watched from the shore. Themistocles of Athens was one of the genuine strategic geniuses of the ancient world. The Greek fleet, perhaps 30-70 triremes, outnumbered by the Persian navy of more than 1,200 vessels, had withdrawn into the narrow strait between Salamis and the Attic coast. The allied Greek commanders were largely in favor of retreating further south. Themistocles understood that retreat would dissolve the alliance and end Greek resistance within weeks. He needed Xerxes to attack in the strait, where Persian numbers would become a disadvantage, where their larger ships would crowd and foul each other, where the Greek triremes could operate at full effect. So he sent a secret message to Xerxes. A trusted slave carried word, supposedly from Themistocles himself, that the Greeks were planning to flee that very night. Xerxes believed him. He ordered the Persian fleet into the strait before dawn. In the early light, the Persian vanguard collided with the Greek line, which was already arrayed and waiting. Behind them, the rest of the fleet continued pushing in, unable to reverse in the confined water, ship after ship pressing into a space already becoming chaotic with wreckage and the noise of breaking oars and bronze rams grinding through hulls. The Persian fleet was broken as an effective fighting force. Xerxes, watching from a throne placed on the shore, made the decision to return to Asia. He crossed back over his pontoon bridges and retreated to Sardis. His general Mardonius was defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea, where the full strength of the Greek alliance broke the Persian land army decisively. The Persian force that had burned Athens retreated from Greece entirely. It would never return. It is important to sit with what happened here, and equally important not to overstate it. The Persian defeat in Greece was not the collapse of the empire. The empire was enormous, wealthy, and structurally intact. The loss cost Persia a province it had never fully controlled, a prestige wound of genuine significance, and a generation of soldiers and ships. It did not cost Persia Babylon, or Egypt, or the satrapies, or Persepolis, or any of the central apparatus of Achaemenid power. But something had shifted. The Persian Empire had advanced from the days of Cyrus with the quality of a natural force, absorbing everything, unstoppable in the way that rivers and seasons are unstoppable. Greece was the first place it had advanced and then retreated, the first place it had burned and been unable to hold. The Greeks understood that the empire was not a natural force. It was made of the same mortal stuff as everything else. Xerxes himself is one of history's more complicated figures, viewed almost entirely through the distorting lens of Greek accounts written by people who had reason to make him a villain. The Persian record shows a king who was a competent administrator, who continued his father's building program at Persepolis with genuine vision, and who ruled an empire of staggering complexity for over 2 decades without it fracturing. He was, most likely, a capable king who undertook a campaign that failed, and whose failure was then written by the victors into the defining story of why freedom is better than empire. He was assassinated in 465 BCE in his bedchamber by a court conspiracy involving the captain of his guard. The manner of his death, quiet, domestic, a knife in the dark rather than a sword on the battlefield, is perhaps the most Persian possible ending. An empire so large and so long-lived that the greatest threats to its kings came not from foreign armies, but from the men closest to the throne. The empire breathed on. The stone columns of Persepolis still caught the morning light. The royal road still hummed with horses and messages, and the daily commerce of 50 million lives. But the westward momentum was spent, and in the mounting kingdoms of Macedon, on the northern edge of the Greek world, a dynasty was slowly gathering the kind of strength that empires, grown accustomed to their own size, are always the last to notice. A dynasty whose most famous son was not yet born. The last chapter of the Persian Empire was not written by the Persians. It never is. There is a particular quality to the century that followed, Salamis. A long, late afternoon light that falls across the Persian Empire in the historical record, golden and still, full of the richness of accumulated power, but carrying already the faint coolness that comes before the dark. The empire did not decline quickly. It persisted, administered, taxed, and built for 130 more years after the fleet retreated from the Greek straits. Some of those years were prosperous, some were brilliant, but something had changed in the architecture of the thing. Something structural, deep in the load-bearing walls, invisible from the outside until the moment it was not. The pattern of the later Achaemenid Empire is one that students of imperial history will recognize with the resigned familiarity of a recurring dream. It is the pattern of the court becoming more important than the kingdom, of the throne becoming the object of ambition rather than the instrument of governance, of the men closest to the king. The chamberlains, the eunuchs, the senior wives of the harem, the commanders of the royal guard, accumulating the real levers of power, while the king himself becomes increasingly ornamental, increasingly isolated, increasingly the prisoner of the ceremonial apparatus designed to project his magnificence. After Xerxes was murdered in 465 BCE, the succession to the Persian throne became a story of recurring violence. The most dramatic illustration of how far the rot had penetrated came in 401 BCE, when the younger brother of Artaxerxes II, a prince named Cyrus, in one of history's more pointed coincidences, raised a mercenary army including Greek soldiers for hire and marched against the reigning king. At the Battle of Cunaxa, near Babylon, the Greek contingent performed with devastating effectiveness, and then found themselves stranded deep in Persian territory when Cyrus was killed in the fighting. Their long march home through hostile country, recorded by the soldier historian Xenophon in his Anabasis, became one of the great survival stories of the ancient world. But the Anabasis carried a lesson that Persia's enemies absorbed and Persia's kings apparently did not: that a disciplined Greek force could march through the heart of the empire, fight its way past Persian opposition at every turn, and emerge alive. The interior was not invulnerable. It never had been. The satrapies grew more independent as the court grew more consumed with itself. The Great Revolt of the satraps in the 360s BCE saw multiple regional governors simultaneously challenge royal authority. Egypt broke free of Persian control entirely in the early 4th century. The throne passed, eventually, to Darius III, a provincial governor plucked from obscurity, who then proved rather harder to manage than expected, forcing his own kingmaker to drink the poison he had prepared for others. It was 3030 BCE. The empire's administration was intact, its revenues enormous, its armies still formidable. But its center had been poisoned, literally and figuratively, so many times that it no longer held the coherent will that Cyrus and Darius the Great had poured into its foundations. In that same year, 336 BCE, a 20-year-old king came to the throne of Macedon. His name was Alexander. Alexander of Macedon crossed into Asia in 334 BCE with an army of perhaps 37,000 men, a force that, placed beside the army Xerxes had assembled, would have been invisible. He had no navy of significance, no treasury, no logistical base in the territories he was entering. What he had was an absolute, unshakable certainty that he would win, and a tactical intelligence so electric and so instinctive that it functioned, in battle, almost like a force of nature. The three great battles of the campaign have the quality of a nightmare in which you run as fast as you can and the thing pursuing you runs faster. At the Granicus River in 334 BCE, Alexander broke the Persian satrapal forces of western Anatolia in a cavalry charge so reckless that his senior commanders begged him not to attempt it, and the satrapies of western Anatolia fell within a season. At Issus in 333 BCE, Darius III himself took the field and very nearly succeeded in cutting Alexander's supply lines. What followed was a battle on a narrow coastal plain, another geography that negated Persian numbers, and another Macedonian charge directly at the Persian center, directly at Darius himself. The Persian king fled in his chariot, leaving behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his entire royal household. Alexander treated them with the elaborate courtesy that the Cyrus tradition would have recognized. Gaugamela in 331 BCE was the last battle and the most extraordinary. Darius had chosen his ground with care, a broad, flat plain near the ruins of Nineveh, where Persian chariots and cavalry could operate freely. He had his engineers level the ground further. He had, by most estimates, a force of perhaps 100,000 soldiers facing Alexander's 47,000. Alexander won by attacking the gap that opened when the Persian line extended to prevent an outflanking movement. He drove a wedge of cavalry directly into the widening space in the Persian center, aiming once again at Darius. Once again, Darius fled. The Persian army, enormous and still largely intact, lost cohesion at the moment its king turned and rode. Babylon surrendered without a fight. Susa surrendered. Persepolis fell in the winter of 3030 BCE. What happened next at Persepolis remains, across 23 centuries, one of history's most debated acts. Alexander burned it, the great ceremonial complex that Darius the Great had begun and Xerxes had completed. The Apadana with its forest of 20-meter columns, the gate of all nations, the treasury, the hall of 100 columns, was set alight and left to burn. The ancient sources offer competing explanations: deliberate policy, the final punctuation of Greek revenge for the burning of Athens 150 years earlier, or the decision of a single reckless night, drink taken, an Athenian courtesan named Tias proposing the gesture, and Alexander agreeing. Some ancient writers record that he regretted it the following morning. Perhaps all of these things were true at once. Simultaneously, policy and impulse, symbolism and accident, revenge and regret. The stone survived the fire. It always does. And what it showed, when the rubble was finally cleared, was not submission. It was, even in ruin, a record of welcome, of peoples walking toward each other, of an empire that, at its best, had understood something about how human beings wish to be treated. Darius III did not survive to see Persepolis burn. Fleeing east after Gaugamela, he was overtaken by his own courtiers, led by the Bactrian satrap Bessus, who murdered him and left his body beside the road. Alexander, arriving shortly after, found his great enemy dead in a cart. He covered the body with his own cloak and arranged for it to be sent to Persepolis for burial with the honors due to an Achaemenid king. It was a gesture that Cyrus himself might have recognized and might even have approved. Alexander did not destroy the Persian Empire so much as inherit it, in the same way and with the same deliberate absorption that Cyrus had once inherited the Median one. He kept the satrapy system. He wore Persian dress at court. He adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony. He married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, in a mass wedding at Susa in 3024 BCE, designed to fuse the Macedonian and Persian aristocracies into a single ruling class. He was not conquering Persia. He was becoming it. He died at Babylon in 3020 BCE, aged 32. His empire fractured immediately into the competing kingdoms of his generals. The Persian heartland passed to Seleucus, whose Seleucid dynasty would govern it for generations, layering Greek language and culture over the Persian foundation without ever quite dissolving it. What remained beneath all the layers was Persia itself. The plateau endured. The languages endured. Modern Persian, Farsi, is a direct, lineal descendant of Old Persian, carrying in its grammar and its poetry a thread that runs unbroken back to the inscriptions of Darius and the royal proclamations of Cyrus. The administrative traditions of the satrapies, the relay postal system, the principle of governing diverse peoples through local custom rather than enforced uniformity, all of these passed in modified forms into the Seleucid Empire, then into the Parthian Empire that replaced it, then into the Sassanid Persian Empire that came after that, and from there, by 100 indirect channels, into the administrative vocabulary of the Islamic caliphates that would eventually spread across the same territories. The Cyrus cylinder was adopted by the United Nations in 1971 as an early symbol of human rights. Whether or not it deserves that title in its full modern sense, the adoption speaks to something real that Cyrus had articulated in the political language of the 6th century BCE, a vision of governance that people 25 centuries later still found worth claiming as their own. The idea that conquered peoples might retain their gods, their customs, their languages, their dignity, that an empire might be held together by something other than fear, is not a small idea. It is, in fact, one of the largest ideas in political history. Go to Persepolis today, and the columns are still standing. Not all of them. Alexander's fire and 2.5 millennia of wind and earthquake and the slow, patient gravity of time have done their work. but 13 of the original 36 columns of the Abaddon still reached toward the Iranian sky, their bull capitals catching the light in the late afternoon, exactly as they caught it when Darius the Great first stood below them and saw what he had made. The processional reliefs along the staircases are still there, worn, yes, and missing detail, but present. The delegations still walk, the Medes still lead horses, the Lydians still carry their vessels, the Ethiopians still shoulder their elephant tusks. The stone faces still look ahead with that expression the ancient carvers gave them, somewhere between serenity and determination, going somewhere they have been going for 2,500 years. The Persian Empire lasted 220 years, from the accession of Cyrus to the death of Darius III. In that time, it held more of the known world under a single administration than any power before it. It built roads and posted letters and struck coins and carved in 3 languages simultaneously so that all people might read. It produced Cyrus, who wept for the brevity of human life and let his enemies keep their gods. It produced Darius, who built his story in stone 300 meters above a road, and gave the world a postal system and a phrase cut one day into the granite of a government building in Washington. It produced Xerxes, flawed and magnificent, who wept on a throne above the Hellespont and burned a city he could not hold, and was murdered in his sleep by the men he trusted most. It produced, at its long end, a civilization so fully formed that the man who destroyed it put on its clothes and married its daughters and kept its institutions, and never fully decided where Macedon ended and Persia began. The wind moves across the plateau. The columns stand somewhere beneath the stone of Pasargadae, in a tomb that Alexander once ordered restored, and the world has been losing and finding ever since. The first and greatest of the Persian kings lies in the ground of his ancestors. A short inscription, quiet as the man who composed it, still marks the place. O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. He did, and the world has not been the same since.